Now, our panel, Republican strategist Alice Stewart and Democratic strategist Maria Cardona. Good to have you both on.
Hey, Jim, thanks.
Hi, Jim.
So, Alice, we have seen Trump in court before. In fact, this is the third time in recent months. But in those instances, he chose to appear. He calculated it was in his political interest. This time, he is required to. And by the way, this is not going to be over soon. It's going to last perhaps 6 to 8 weeks. How does that affect the campaign? And in your view, I wonder, Alice, how does it affect his chances with voters to see him in a criminal courtroom for all those days and all those weeks?
Well, first and foremost, look, a lot of the legwork that goes on with rallies and get out the vote efforts and opportunities to connect with voters, the legwork is done by advanced teams and staff, and he just parachutes in or flies in and flies out. From his standpoint, it's not a very time-consuming endeavor. But realistically, the fact that he is not able to get out there and talk more about the issues that are top of mind with voters, that's going to be a problem. And the question of how this will impact voters, look, his voters, Republican voters, are on board. We just heard Governor Sununu talk about his voters aren't going to be swayed by this. Democratic voters are certainly not in his camp. The question is, these independent voters are going to make the difference in the general election in November. And a New York Times Siena poll shows that a trial is one thing, but a conviction will be a game changer. And some of them may change their mind from him if he's convicted. But right now, the trial doesn't appear to be swaying too many people, independent and late deciders, voters.
You reference a poll. This was a Quinnipiac poll. It asked the question, if Trump is convicted of falsifying business records, 29% said it would make him less likely to vote for him. 12% said more likely. 55% would not matter. So a small number that would say that it would impact them negatively. I wonder, as you look at those numbers, Maria Cardona, do you see this as significant? Do you believe those polls reflect how voters might be impacted by the results of this trial?
I think that particular poll, Jim, reflects pretty much what his base would feel like, which, as Alice said, is really not going to move them no matter what happens. But I've seen several other polls that indicate that a conviction would flip them, but also the New York Times Siena poll that just came out said almost 2/3 of voters view this particular trial, the fraudulent business records and hiding the hush money payments to the porn star Stormy Daniels, they view those charges as either somewhat or very serious. And so I think that as voters, especially independents, continue to view this guy, Donald Trump, day after day after day in a courtroom, they're going to say to themselves, do we really want a criminal defendant in chief to be the one that's going to represent us on the global stage for 4 years as our president? And I think the answer is going to be no. And what this trial is going to show us, that this isn't just about business records, and the desperation of Trump's allies trying to convince us as such tells me that they're very worried about it, because it's actually about election interference and the deceit and lies that Trump tried to tell, frankly did tell, the voters in 2016, that frankly was a big reason why he got elected, because they did not have all of the information at their fingertips in terms of what he tried to pull and pulling the wool over their heads. And so I think that's what's going to come out to light.
Alice, let me ask you your view, because there's the one factor here to see the Republican nominee in a criminal courtroom, but there's also the substance of the charges and the case. I spoke to former Republican Congressman Ken Buck last week, and he said that when, and by the way, he's speaking about his own voters, Republican voters, that when they are reminded that this was about an extramarital affair, an attempt to pay money or the payment of money to hide that fact from voters during an election campaign, that will affect them perhaps more than Republicans realize. And I wonder what your response is to that thinking.
I think there's an argument to be made with regard to that. But look, we've all known Donald Trump for many years now, and I think it's a bipartisan consensus, even amongst his supporters, that for the most part, when it comes to his personal life and porn stars and hush money, they recognize he's a dirtbag. But it's going to be much different when we're just talking about those kind of issues, when he's actually facing actual charges in a courtroom that are criminal charges. And again, right now, he's innocent until proven guilty. But if this were to be a conviction, as you said, it could sway voters. But Donald Trump is making the argument. My dear friend Maria talked about threats to democracy. Donald Trump, every time he goes in and out of that courtroom, he is going to talk about this trial and all of these legal issues as threats to democracy. It's an assault on a political adversary, an enemy, and it's also an opportunity to go against someone who is the opponent of the Democratic president. And he's going to make that case, whether or not it sits with independent voters. That's going to be his argument in and out of the courtroom.
Yeah. Listen, that's exactly the argument he made this morning on his way into the courthouse. He is expected to speak on his way out this afternoon. I wouldn't be surprised if we hear it again. Before we go, Maria, President Biden has deliberately stayed away from most public commentary on this case to attempt to establish some distance between him and what's happening here. I wonder, do you think the president has to push back more explicitly on that charge and say, listen, this was a decision of a Manhattan prosecutor in this case, or a special counsel in the January 6th and documents cases, or is it smart for him to keep his distance?
I don't think he has to comment on this at all, because every image that we're seeing on our TV screens is going to speak volumes and be much more effective than President Biden having to address it directly. And in fact, he should be doing exactly what he's doing now, which is going out, campaigning, talking to the people. He's going to be going out to Pennsylvania, talking about his massive accomplishments, talking about threats to democracy, like my dear friend Alice said, talking about how there is a huge election that is coming where the choice is going to be very stark between somebody who does represent a huge threat to democracy and somebody, Joe Biden, who wants to protect democracy. And frankly, I think the more that Donald Trump tries to break down and diminish our institutions of justice, again, for his base, that is catnip. But for independent voters and for people who have already seen Donald Trump as a threat, or the ones who voted against him in 2020, that is not going to play well. And those are the voters, the independent voters, who Trump needs to add to his coalition. And the more that he tries to diminish our institutions, the more they're going to say, again, why do we want a dirtbag in chief? Why do we want a criminal defendant in chief? We deserve better. And Donald Trump is going to help us make that case.
Well, ultimately, it'll be up to the voters whether that sways their vote. Alice, Stewart, Maria Cardona, thanks so much to both of you.